Hello, and thank you all so much for your patience while I was finishing up what was easily the busiest summer of my life. I look forward to, now that I'm home again, to producing something a little bit more consistent, though just as low quality as you would expect from a very high-strung academic with little to no social skills and a tendency to ramble on about nothing at every available opportunity. I hate this topic. It is like all questions that begin with some sort of innate and biological notion of race, not a scientific question. But even beyond that, the kinds of experiments that we would have to do to carry out the scientific method in a way that would answer this question are impossible. We can't selectively breed humans and then take their children and lock them in a room and feed them all the same thing and expose them to the same child rearing techniques and the same educational programs. It obviously is not an experiment that's possible for ethical reasons and financial reasons and lots of other reasons. So if we can't do the kinds of experiments that we would have to do in order to settle this question, what kind of research does that leave us with? Well, on the one hand, we have people like Charles Murray, and there's plenty of arguments about the other side, about how Murray and other race realists misrepresent their data or use flawed methods and don't actually address the questions they're trying to answer. Well, if there's so much data, why do I hate this topic? Well, because we can't do the experiments that we need to in order to actually scientifically answer this question, all that happens is that people continuously point out the flaws in each other's studies, with both sides being correct, that there are methodological flaws to the experiments that are being conducted, and that they don't adequately address the question. That just leads to people becoming more entrenched in whatever it was they believed before, because it's true, neither side can actually answer this question. So I'm going to try something different. Instead of jumping into the conversation about race and IQ, I'm going to present to you 10 things that impact a child's IQ scores and hamper their cognitive development growing up. And each of these 10 things are heritable, but not genetic, which is to say that they're passed down generation to generation, but they're not biological. And if that sounds weird, keep in mind that everything is inherited, including social systems and governments. Your citizenship is inherited, your marital status, how often you watch TV, not all of those are related to biology. And those things aren't just heritable, they're heritable in exactly the same way that biological phenomena are. There's something else about these 10 factors. They're unevenly distributed across racial lines, and each factor has been associated with a swing between 2 and 24 points in IQ scores in both twin studies and genome-wide association studies. Taken together, there's plenty of reason that these, in addition to other factors like them, are responsible for the gap between IQ scores among races. But there's of course no way for me to experimentally prove that because, again, those experiments aren't possible. But given what a marked and compounding effect that they have, there's a pretty good argument that they do. There's one more thing that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, though I won't go into depth in this video. IQ scores aren't always a great predictor of intelligence. They don't predict the best chess players or musicians or artists. It's not unrelated to intelligence, but it's way too narrow of a definition. Additionally, IQ scores go up if you take the test more than once because you have practice. So those who receive better educations or who take something like a practice SAT or ACT test or tutorial course, they're more likely to do better on IQ tests as well. It's not a useless measure, but it's not the same thing as intelligence. Okay, so enough distractions. Without further ado, here's 10 things correlated with intelligence that explain the racial IQ gap a lot better than biology. Number 1, breastfeeding. Now, many of the studies out there that deal with the relationship between breastfeeding and IQ don't necessarily assert that there's a relationship between the two directly, but instead that raised IQ score is a result of confounding variables associated with the decision to breastfeed, such as environmental factors or the socioeconomic status of your family. But a 2015 meta-analysis found that even when you control for the environment and maternal conditions and IQ, that studies that kept mothers as demographically close to each other as possible still found jumps in IQ associated with breastfeeding itself. The mean difference in IQ scores between babies who were breastfed and those who weren't was 3.5, and there's a swing between 2 points and 8 points depending on the study. So how does breastfeeding factor into an IQ gap between the so-called races? Well, white women are more than twice as likely to breastfeed as their African American counterparts. This is largely a consequence of poverty and lower socioeconomic statuses. In two-parent working households, mothers often had to stop breastfeeding early or weren't able to breastfeed at all because they needed to return back to work. Number 2, gestational age. Now, premature babies are born all the time, and it's not something that a mother can control. But it's also true that the longer a baby has to develop within the womb, the better off they tend to develop both intellectually and physically. The closer a child gets to 40 weeks in the womb, the more likely they are to hit developmental milestones throughout their life. A 2003 survey found that African American mothers are still far more likely than any other demographic to have preterm or low birth weight babies, which brings me to point number 3, birth weight, which is obviously related to gestational age but isn't the same. A baby can be brought to full gestational age and still have low birth weight. A Danish study found that those with low birth weights tended to also have lower IQs. This has been confirmed in twin studies as well, with the bigger gap between twin birth rates also meaning a bigger gap between IQs. And these cognitive consequences are long-term. They persist well into adulthood. And they're pretty severe. The difference between low birth weight babies, according to the study, and their more typically weighted counterparts, which was measured in this at about 7 to 8 pounds, was a whole 5 IQ points, which is half of the racial IQ gap right there. Now, again, these factors probably build on each other, so we can't say that any one of these things is responsible for that many points, but you start to get a sense about how these add up. These effects persist even when you control for gestational age. The percentage of full-term infants with low birth weight is twofold higher for African American infants than it is for white infants, and there are still persistent gaps in infant mortality. These gaps are likely caused by an accumulation of maternal risk factors over time associated with prolonged experiences with poverty and other kinds of intergenerational trauma that accumulate due to systematic disenfranchisement. Which brings me to number 4, depression. Prenatal maternal depression is a serious issue, though it rarely receives as much attention as something like postpartum depression does. But there's a good amount of evidence to support the idea that prenatal depression directly influences the development of fetal nervous systems, including the brain. And there's a large disparity in how depression is distributed. A CDC study found that African Americans tend to have depression at roughly twice the rate of whites. The precise mechanism for how depression impacts cognitive development is not totally understood, but one factor that depression is associated with, as anyone who's ever been depressed can tell you, is a less healthy diet, which brings me to number 5, maternal diet during pregnancy. Maternal diet matters a lot for a developing fetus because diet directly impacts the womb environment and therefore directly impacts development. Researchers from King's College in Canada and London found that there's a strong link between the consumption of junk foods, which are processed foods which are high in either trans fat, sodium, or both, and decreased IQ scores and impaired cognitive development in children. While it might be easy to chalk that up to just a personal choice or parental failing, it's a lot more complicated than that. Researchers at Johns Hopkins have documented how, even when you control for poverty levels, that Black and Hispanic communities tend to have a lot less supermarkets and a lot lower availability of fresh produce than their white counterparts. As a result, there's less access to whole grain foods, healthy produce, fruits, things of that nature, which constrain a mother's options quite a bit. Maternal nutrition isn't the only kind of nutrition that matters for IQ scores, though. Which brings me to number 6, childhood nutrition and the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect is about a lot more than nutrition. It's about the overall changes that occur in a relatively short period of time while a nation is industrializing. There's now data from over 20 industrialized nations that show rapid IQ rises over a couple decades. And I think the most incredible one happened in rural Kenya, which showed that IQ scores jumped by a massive 24 points. And this is obviously more than just one factor. It's about improved nutrition, improved environmental complexity, parental literacy, a whole host of factors that relate to an overall environment. But it does give you a really good sense of the nature of this problem. If IQ scores can jump that many points in such a short period of time, then it really makes you wonder why people like Charles Murray say that the racial IQ gap can't be closed by environmental changes. Because remember, 24 points is more than twice the gap between Black and white IQ scores in the United States. Number 7, spanking. A 2009 study from the University of New Hampshire looked at 1,500 children and found that those who experienced regular spankings tend to do about 5 points worse on their IQ test than those who weren't. The researchers believe that spanking leads to stress, which means it's harder for children to focus in learning environments, which makes them less likely to learn the essential skills like mathematics that they need to do well on IQ tests. Okay. Number 8. Before I talk about a few environmental specifics, I want to talk generally about a 1997 study. It's very groundbreaking at the time. It looked at 50,000 twins across 210 studies and found that the environment was a much more persuasive explanation for variance in IQs than genetics was. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, our understanding of nature versus nurture is completely changed. But this study was important because it looked at a bunch of different factors and showed how strong the correlation can be for things like wages, educational attainment, healthcare accessibility of both parent and child. This also explains the recent tendency for IQ scores to decline across the board. Researchers at the University of Minnesota have noted that even exceptionally gifted individuals by the 3rd or 4th generation produce offspring that are no more exceptional than anyone else. But the environment is about more than jobs and wages and healthcare. It's also about the literal environment, which brings me to number 9, air pollution. Air and food pollutants can both impact the womb environment quite a bit. A study published in Pediatrics found a 4-point IQ gap by age 5 among children whose mothers were exposed to pollutants in the air during pregnancy. The study focused on pollutants like burning gas, coal, and oil, and other things that you're more likely to find in city and poor neighborhoods. Another study in environmental health perspectives found a link between air pollutants and increased rates of ADHD. And researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health linked air pollutants with increased chances for autism. But the environment is a lot more than just the air, which brings me to, finally, number 10, environmental toxins. There are more environmental toxins than I can cover in this video, but two of the most noteworthy are lead and mercury. Even at relatively small doses, these can impact a child's IQ score by a pretty substantial amount. For example, every 5 microgram per deciliter increase in someone's blood is associated with an almost 2-point drop in IQ score. And participants in studies today tend to have about twice the levels of lead in their blood as they did in the 1980s. And lead-related cognitive injuries are severe. They persist into adulthood, and they tend to impact people throughout their lives. One of the most significant factors associated with the presence of environmental toxins is landfill siting. Landfills tend to be overwhelmingly and disproportionately sited in neighborhoods that are densely populated by Black and Latino communities. And reports published in a wide range of places, from the United Church of Christ to different universities around the globe, have found that not only are environmental toxins more likely to be found in neighborhoods of color, but also things are getting worse in a lot of places since the 80s. Communities face the same problems, but now there's even less support because less money is being allocated for government enforcement, environmental justice initiatives, weakening health protections, all come together to mean environments that are a lot more polluted than they used to be. If you added up the impact of all 10 factors, you'd wind up with something absurd, like a 50-point swing in IQ scores. Which brings me to an important limitation. Many of these factors confound each other, which means they share a root in poverty or parental literacy or any number of other factors. But they can also be isolated and identified, and they do account for far more than the racial IQ gap. And they are racially stratified and consistent with findings on both sides, including Charles Murray's data. Is this a definitive answer? Unfortunately, science can't give you that. But it can provide you with the most logical explanation. Most importantly, these 10 factors are malleable. Race realists like to assert that the racial IQ gap is a permanent fixture to justify doing nothing for underserved communities. I think this data provides a pretty compelling case for every child having access to the best nutrition, healthcare, and environment possible. But what do you think? Tell me in the comments, and see you next time.